You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about transcending the dualism of vanguardism and spontaneism. We'll be looking at some writings by Dunayevskaya from 1953, where she tackles this problem by looking at Hegel's absolutes. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. In just a moment, we'll be talking about vanguardism and spontaneism, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a moment to talk about some current events. We are recording this current event section on Wednesday, October 19th, and we're going to be talking about a few different revelations in the media recently about the depth of support for Trump and for the January 6th insurrection amongst various parts of the military and the Justice Department. There was a report this week out about this leaked memo concerning the extent to which members of the FBI were sympathetic to the January 6th coup attempt. There was a piece in the New York Times this week about the extent to support for election lies and for the big lie amongst members of the military. Especially the article focuses on combat vets who are running for office from the far right. And of course, there's the ongoing story about the degree to which the Secret Service was cooperating with Trump's coup. We can only assume what might have happened because of this apparently intentional campaign to delete text messages. Regarding this FBI memo, I just read some summaries of it in different news stories, but Andrew, you said you found the actual memo itself.
I've got the memo and we'll include the link, and it was written from somebody redacted to Paul Abate, who was Associate Deputy Director of the FBI. Now he's Deputy Director of the FBI, and this was written exactly 1 week after January 6, 2021. This person within the FBI is reporting on what's going on in field offices of the FBI about kind of pro-insurrection or semi-pro-insurrection sentiment within the FBI. He says, for my first and second-hand information from conversations since January 6, there is at best a sizable percentage of the employee population that felt sympathetic to the group that stormed the Capitol and said it was no different than the BLM protests of last summer. Several also lamented that the only reason this is getting more attention is because of political correctness. He says, I literally had to explain to an agent from a blue state the difference between the BLM protests and an insurgent mob whose purpose was to prevent the execution of democratic processes at the behest of a sitting president. One is a smattering of criminals, the other is an organized group of domestic terrorists. He reports on a supervisory special agent in a red state office who told him that over 70% of his counter-terrorism squad and about 75% of the agents in his office disagreed with the violence but could understand where the frustration was coming from, leading to the protesters getting carried away. Sounds like some platypi and Jacobin people. Other people chalked it up to, people just being quarantined and losing their jobs because of COVID. And then there's some redacted stuff about one squad having their TV on Newsmax, that they used to listen to Fox News, but then said it started to report fake news after the election. This is interesting. The person who's writing this says he's spoken to multiple African-American agents who have turned down asks to join SWAT, Surgical Weapons and Tactics, because they do not trust that every member of their office's SWAT team would protect them in an armed conflict, etc., etc. These people are representative of a larger group within the organization. In other words, all of this pro-insurrection stuff. Do I think they were in the group storming the Capitol? No. And then he goes into state and local cops, retired and current military personnel who were involved in the insurrection. At least one current federal agent is under investigation. A current Secret Service agent is under administrative leave, suspension, blah, blah, blah. And then nothing about how the Bureau, that is the FBI, nothing about how the Bureau is comprised is unique from any of those other organizations. Right? I mean, he's telling the other people of the FBI this, so.
Well, reading these articles immediately reminded me of a conversation which we must have had very recently on the podcast, and in the context of lamenting the very slow and tepid response to the Capitol insurrection on the part of the Biden administration. I think it was you, Andrew, who speculated that some of the tepidness and carefulness of the response may be due to the fear of Democrats, fear of people in the Justice Department, that being too aggressive with their prosecution of these insurrectionists is going to cause harm to their own departments, or possibly like bring us closer to even civil war if sizable amounts of the military and the Justice Department and the FBI and police officers are sympathetic to the insurrectionists.
We have a situation, first of all, within the courts, and also within law enforcement and the Justice Department and so forth, of the situation of dual power. I mean, basically, it doesn't matter that the Democrats are in control of Congress and the presidency, because in the courts and law enforcement and so forth, in the administration, in the Department of Justice, you got Trumpism there. And I think that everybody's got to think twice about what's going to be the reaction if we go by the book too much, if we don't placate these folks to some extent. Look, we know that this was going back as far back as 2016, when the FBI was investigating Hillary Clinton's emails. And a lot of that had to do with pro-Trump, anti-Clinton sentiment within the New York office of the FBI. And Comey was like, he felt like he couldn't just like blow this off, and he felt like he had to go public and say, investigation is still open. All of this, that was to placate the Trumpism that was rife in the New York office. So these people, I mean, I understand, but I can't be sympathetic. I can't be sympathetic with them. They have a responsibility, and they have a responsibility to crack down against this stuff. You might win, you might lose, but this playing footsie with these people it just gets worse and worse and worse, and they hold on to more and more power each year.
Well, on to this New York Times story about combat vets running for office from the extreme right. The story points out that traditionally, both parties have presented political candidates who are veterans of the military as having a certain bipartisan appeal. The patriotism and blah, blah, blah has something that transcends, the partisanship, blah, blah, blah. But now we're seeing this phenomena where the veterans who are running as Republicans are like the extreme right of the Trumpites. This was not really surprising to me because I associate the military with like most reactionary parts of our government. But it's like so many things in the world of Trumpism, we finally see the real face of so many things. Things that were once like occluded and obscured, thinly veiled, just become more out in the open and blazing. So this is not like a surprising phenomenon to me, but it's still worrying. And it's also worrying just because people, veterans, especially influential ones, they have influence within the military establishment as well. And like dual power within the military, like growing proto-fascist or fascist segments of the military, that's like a really dangerous situation for our country to be in. And I, again, don't see any sign that Democrats have any real plan to deal with that problem. I don't know how you deal with that problem, but it doesn't seem like anyone's really taking it seriously.
They're not taking it seriously. I felt like the New York Times even kind of put a smile face on what they were doing, basically saying they were anti-war and anti-interventionist and so forth. It wasn't until way down in the middle of the story that you get Ruben Gallego He's a congressman from, I think, Arizona. He's a former Marine. He was in Iraq in combat. And he says, we all understand the Constitution of the United States, and some of these men are really leaning into outright fascism. So it took until the middle of the story and a Democratic congressman, so they had words that they could say that it wasn't just anti-intervention and anti-war sentiment. That's kind of how they try to portray it for some reason here.
Yeah, well, especially with if anything that involves the military in this country, there's just this moral blackmail where there's a certain process of like genuflection and thank you for your service, blah, 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 that has to be said before you can even get into anything political. Institutionally, the New York Times has to be so careful that they don't just sound like they're hating on the vets, you know? There's just this obnoxious thing we have in our country. You're right, like mainstream news organizations cannot afford to continue to give that level of deference to the military if they've openly fascist elements within them.
Let's talk about the Secret Service a little bit. I mean, this is extremely interesting because we've got all of these text messages that disappeared. Oh, well, we were just doing a pro forma wiping of the phones and resetting them. Nobody believes that.
Nobody believes it, and they must have known that nobody was going to believe it. They did it anyway. So it's like a giant middle finger.
Right. Of course, they did it immediately before they knew what was going to happen. But what it tells me is that it was so egregious and so blatant that they had to say, uh-oh, we cannot be caught with this. We have to risk whatever comes down the road by doing this because this ties Trump to this ties us to Trump. It might be a middle finger, or it might be this is a desperate move of people who are very desperate.
Right, that's true. Because it has to be, worse than obstruction. Right, if you're going to do something which is obstruction, then there must be a calculation that the crime is worse than the obstruction.
Or it could be like what you say is we're going to get away with this, and that we'll show them. It could be that.
Well, they very much have gotten away with it because there hasn't really been any consequences.
Right. There haven't been consequences, especially to the Secret Service yet. Now, what's very interesting is that you did have some Secret Service testimony regarding what was going on with Pence in the parking garage underneath the Capitol when he was hiding out on January 6th. And there's this incident that we know of where, they tell him get in the car, and he goes, I'm not getting in that car. I trust you, he says, person he's speaking to, but you're not the one behind the wheel. And the way it was reported by, whoever for the Secret Service is Pence didn't want it to look like the insurrectionists were winning and he was fleeing in fear. But there are people who don't believe that, including people on the January 6th Congressional Committee. I heard one, I think it was Jamie Raskin, and he just said, we basically have finished our public hearings and we're close to finishing our investigation, but this really looms large. And it wouldn't loom large if it were just a matter of Pence not wanting it to look like he was fleeing. The real point is, within the Secret Service, there were people who were not going to obey orders, that were going to obey Trump's orders, and they were going to get Pence out of there, maybe as far away as Alaska, so that he couldn't certify the vote. Maybe even hand him over to the people with the gallows there. God knows what. And Pence isn't talking, and that is, why is that? Is it that he thinks he's got a political future, or that he reckons, well, I'm a Christian nationalist, and maybe I'm not really for fascism, but if it's a choice between the Democrats and fascism, maybe fascism.
Well, I can only speculate on Mike Pence's calculations, but Mike Pence, if you're out there and you want to come on the podcast and tell us what you're thinking, you're welcome to join us anytime. But that's it for our current events section. Up next, we're going to talk about spontaneism and vanguardism and Hegel and Dunayevskaya and all sorts of great stuff. So stay tuned. So on today's episode, we are going to be talking about a piece that Andrew has just written. It's called Dunayevskaya's 1953 Letters, Transcending Vanguardism and Spontaneism. Andrew, there's a bunch of stuff we're going to get into in this paper, but try to give us some context and for reading what are kind of difficult writing by Dunayevskaya that she did in 1953. She's talking about Hegel, her interpretation of some elements of Hegel. She's talking about this duality of vanguardism and spontaneism and how to transcend that. And there's a lot going on. Maybe you can give us like a summary of what you were trying to do with the paper.
Okay, I'll do my best. Yeah, it's the letters are very difficult, not even entirely because of the subject matter, and the fact that it's heavy duty Hegel interpretation, but they weren't written for publication. They were written to co-leaders of hers in the Johnson Forest Tendency, C.L.R. James, Grace Lee, and she had long philosophic discussion with them by means of letters and in-person conversations and so forth. So they had a lot of background, and she was writing in an informal way to people she knew very well. So you have some context there that they share that if you personally don't share it, you're not going to get what's going on. That's a big problem. But basically, what happens is, the Johnson Forest tendency was a kind of unorthodox tendency within the Trotskyist movement. About 3 years before she writes this, 1950, they leave Trotskyism for good. The tendency becomes an independent organization, correspondence committees, and then the internal contradictions within the tendency more and more come to the fore. And when they left Trotskyism, they rejected the theory of the vanguard party, the idea that, the masses on their own only have a trade union consciousness or, want reforms within capitalism, that they're not spontaneously revolutionary. They rejected that. But when you have that rejection, what do you have positively as the alternative? Where do you go? Well, what these 53 letters and the whole subsequent trajectory shows is there are radically different directions that you can go in. There's the direction of Dunayevskaya and Marxist-Humanism on the one hand, and the directions of, which were slightly different, but kind of the same, of C.L.R. James and Grace Lee Boggs on the other. And this was already starting to gnaw on Dunayevskaya in the early 50s. One thing that happened was when they formed their new organization upon leaving the Socialist Workers' Party, the Trotskyist movement, the new organization, it had no public presence. They didn't even have like a public newspaper. They had a newsletter, a mimeographed newspaper or whatever, for members and very close friends of the organization. And that never sat very well with her. But the immediate event that precipitated these letters was the death of Stalin. And once Stalin dies, she writes this, very serious piece trying to say, okay, here's what's in store for us. Here are the implications of his death for what's going to be happening in the USSR and for world affairs and for the revolutionary movement. And Grace Lee was the assigned editor of that issue of the newsletter, and she refused to publish it as is. And Dunayevskaya was making a big deal about Stalin's death and the implications of that for the world. And Grace Lee was saying, look, the proletariat doesn't care, the working class doesn't care, the American working class is, they're not into it. And, so what she chose, Grace Lee chose to focus on was this story told by James' wife, who was a young worker in a factory, Selma James. When the news came over the radio that Stalin had died, the women are ignoring it and they're exchanging hamburger recipes. This is a story Dunayevskaya told throughout the years again and again and again. So on the one hand, you got these workers exchanging hamburger recipes. Okay, but that wasn't the entirety of the reaction of the American working class by any means. Charles Denby, who was later the editor-in-chief of Marxist-Humanist organization's newspaper, he was an auto worker, black guy from the very deep South sharecropping family, and he reported what one of the workers around him said. They learned that Stalin had died, and his co-worker says, "I have just the man to replace him, my foreman." So there were two attitudes battling out within the Johnson Forest tendency, and there were two attitudes quite present in the American working class.
So we can be clear for people. You're not just saying like the two attitudes were just about this specific historic moment and whether it was important to write about the death of Stalin and theorize its potential importance to the movement, right? But this was like symbolic of what was to become a bigger disagreement about the role of theory in the movement.
Right. I mean, I don't know whether there's a big overarching battle at the time within the American working class in times of attitudes, but yeah, certainly within the Johnson Forest tendency, this was an incident that sharpened, disclosed two very different alternatives to what to do, how to go once you have repudiated the conception of a vanguard party.
Presumably, Grace Lee Boggs is dismissive of the attempt to talk about Stalin because if this concern is not present spontaneously amongst the working class, it's not worth talking about. I mean, is that the position that...
I don't know that it was ever articulated as such. I know much later in her life, I read an interview with her 10 years ago or so, and she basically characterized Dunayevskaya's politics that Boggs broke from as just searching for signs among workers, among the masses. There are people saying what you want them to say. And she said that she herself went in a very different direction and basically put herself under the leadership of the man who became her husband, James Boggs, a black worker. And the idea is you kind of don't bring your politics and your ideology to the situation, but you follow what the masses are doing or something. I mean, it was not real clear to me what she was saying. She basically thought that Dunayevskaya's stuff was just trying to attribute her own thinking to the masses, or to find find ways in which she could do that. Which I don't think is true at all, but I try to explain in the article what it is. I don't make an issue of that. Grace Lee Boggs said later, but I do try to explain what it is, and it's not that.
I think that is there anything else in terms of the context that you've left out, or should we kind of get into some of the meat of this?
No, I would just reiterate that this whole dispute which broke out, it was a major dispute within the organization, the correspondence committees, the Johnson Forest tendency, about Grace Lee suppressing Dunayevskaya's article, and people were lining up. It was a big thing for a couple of months within the Johnson Forest tendency. So Dunayevskaya basically picks up, she resumes this philosophic correspondence that the three of them had, Lee, James, and herself, that kind of ended in late 1950, early 1951. Now we're already talking about May 1953. She resumes it, and she begins to look at, very carefully, the last chapter of Hegel's Science of Logic and the last chapter of his Philosophy of Mind. They're entitled, respectively, Absolute Idea and Absolute Mind, or Absolute Spirit.
Let's plunge in and see what we can do with this and make sense in a short podcast. Just as a disclaimer for our listeners, we can't cover everything in your paper, and we definitely can't cover everything in Dunayevskaya's 1953 letters in this short 45-minute segment. So people need to, if this inspires them to try to understand this topic some more, they should dip their toe into the topic a little more thoroughly and do some of this reading. And correspond with us. Let us know what you think, and try to figure this stuff out. The first time I read the 1953 letters, I was completely lost.
First time I read it, I couldn't make sense of them. Second time I read it. Third time I read it.
Yeah. But one of the things so I find Hegel very difficult, and sometimes when Dunayevskaya writes about Hegel, I find it difficult. But there are these moments when it starts to make more sense to me. And that's when she's more explicit about the way that she's interpreting terms, categories within Hegel in terms of the Marxist-Humanism, in terms of the struggle for the new society, and because it makes it more concrete for me. I can understand it a little better when it's we're talking about a concrete thing and it's not completely abstract. So you start off talking about why she interprets absolute mind as the new society. Maybe we could start with that. What does that even mean to interpret Hegel's concept of absolute mind as the new society?
First of all, mind does not mean what we tend to mean by mind in English. The German word is Geist. It's often translated as spirit. So the question is, what does Hegel mean by mind or spirit? And in the article I quote John Burbage's Historical Dictionary of Hegelian Philosophy. He says that for Hegel, spirit means self-conscious life, and it applies to the divine as well as the human. Okay, so it's not just otherworldly, it's also worldly. And he also says that in Hegel's earlier book, Phenomenology of Spirit, or Phenomenology of Mind, the chapter on spirit describes a kind of knowledge in which members of a community understand and grasp the complexity of their own interaction. So this is about, a human community understanding itself, the interactions of its members. So it's about the self-understanding of human society. And when you get to the philosophy of mind or the philosophy of spirit, this is the final work of the three works in Hegel's encyclopedia. What we've got is objective mind, subjective mind, and the unification of the two, which is absolute mind. So objective mind is kind of like what we think of as the opposite of mind. This is Hegel's looking at law, he's looking at morality, he's looking at the institution of the family, the state, civil society. So he's looking at social institutions, and he calls this objective mind. Why? Because here the subjective concepts of the spirit permeate, they infuse these institutions. So this is not just inert matter that exists. Okay, these are human institutions. They have some subjectivity to them, even though they actually exist objectively. So here's what Hegel himself has to say, and he wrote this in paragraphs 484, 485 of The Philosophy of Mind, at the start of his discussion of objective mind. He said that freedom is the inward function and aim of the free will, but the free will stands, quote, in relation to an external and already subsisting objectivity. So we've got, the free will of human beings. On the one hand, we've got this objectivity that's already out there. Hegel's an idealist, but he says this objectivity is already out there. It's external to us. And then he says, quote, but the purposive action of this will is to realize its concept, liberty, in these externally objective aspects, making the latter a world molded by the former. In other words, liberty shaped into the actuality of a world. So this is all about the realization of freedom in the actual institutions, social institutions that exist in the real world. It's about the transformation of reality.
You described that very clearly, actually. Maybe I'll repeat it back to you. How's that?
Okay.
So the objective world is these objective institutions are a world created by human subjects, but they have an objectivity outside of human subjectivity because they have a certain permanence that lasts beyond the individual subjectivities of people. It's embedded in institutions and economic structures and political institutions and things. I mean, Hegel's not saying this, right? But in a capitalist society, these institutions operate outside of the control of people. They control the subjects instead of the subjects controlling them. If we were to achieve real liberty, real freedom, we would have to live in a world in which that objective world was transformed in order to be under the collective control of the subjects, rather than some inverted order where the objective world controls the subjects.
Yeah, and I think Hegel did say all of that except for the part about capitalism. Yeah.
So when Dunayevskaya is interpreting this category, absolute mind, as the new society, and in case people aren't familiar with that kind of phrase, the new society, we're talking about a theoretical future society where, I don't know what you want to call it, communism, socialism, post-capitalist world, whatever the label is we want to put on it. That's what people are referring to. When she's interpreting absolute mind as the new society, what exactly is the claim? Is it that this is what Hegel would have said if he understood the way capitalism works? Is it that, well, this is like we're taking like Hegel's logic and applying it to this other thing, which is like the struggle against capitalism. So is it like a claim about the real meaning of Hegel's terms? Is it a claim that this is like an improved version of Hegel given certain like presuppositions of like historical materialism or Marxist critique of capital? Or is it just like an application of Hegel's way of thinking to a different topic outside of Hegel?
Okay, it's definitely not the last of those three. It's definitely not just taking a framework and applying it to a political context.
Because that's sometimes the way people think about Marx and Hegel. She's not doing that.
No, I mean, clearly the context of what Hegel was talking about, just the little that we've talked about right here, clearly the context is political. The realization of freedom in the real institutions of the world. I mean, that's clearly a matter of politics, and this is a man who is writing pretty much in the period immediately following the French Revolution, and so forth. So,
but I just want to make that clear for people, because sometimes people think about, as Marxists, we just kind of take some abstract structure from Hegel and like slap it onto other topics. And that's like the extent to which Hegel is applicable. But this is not her approach at all.
No. Whereas, it's a question of how much Hegel thought that the freedom was realized in the real institutions of the world, and there's all kinds of issues about that. The point, I think, is that the central problematic of the philosophy of mind is this realization of freedom in the real world. It's the unification of objective mind and subjective mind, and that unification is the new society. Whatever you want to call it, okay? You could have a different view of what that unification would be, and so you could have a different view of what would be the new society. But just to keep it on the philosophic level, you no longer have the society that you had where you've got this disjunction, this lack of unity between the two. Now you've got the real world fully infused, fully permeated by what it is to be human. Okay, I mean, for Hegel, it was very clear. It was liberty. It was the free will.
What it means to be human is liberty, free will.
For Hegel, yeah.
Yeah.
You got to be careful here, because it was not for Hegel even like, he wasn't saying that this is a constant, invariable, pre-existing condition of all human beings throughout all time. He said like the Greeks, the ancient Greeks didn't have this concept of liberty. And he was not the only one. I've read this elsewhere. There's a whole book about the origin of consciousness or self-consciousness by this guy Julian Jaynes.
Oh yeah, I know that book.
Yeah, right. So he goes through this very long discussion of all kinds of societies, including the ancient Greeks. I've also read it like in Paul Feyerabend. I mean, it's fairly well accepted that like the ancient Greek thought was not that human beings are free, but that people are basically puppets doing what the gods or whatever command them to do. So this is what it is to be human, but it does not like emerge all at once at the beginning of time. It emerges, through history for Hegel and for many others.
So Dunayevskaya is writing in 1953. She's writing to C.L.R. James and to Grace Lee Boggs, and she's discussing Hegel in the context of this dispute that's broken out in the organization about Dunayevskaya's censored article about Stalin. Why is she turning to Hegel in this particular moment, and what is this reading of Hegel, this interpretation of absolute mind as the new society? What does that have to do with what's going on in the organization?
Right. Why she turned to Hegel, I don't know. They had the three of them, a long discussion on philosophy. Letters 1949, 50, lots of letters into early 51, and then it broke off. But this kind of return to Hegel was part of the organization even before that. C.L.R. James wrote what was called the Nevada document, because he wrote it in Nevada. Later it was published as Notes on Dialectics, and he kind of gave a reading about what was significant in Hegel for us, for the Trotskyist movement, and for the Johnson Forest Tendency specifically. specifically. Dunayevskaya later said, she liked it at the time. It's very clear from the 1953 letters that she says, okay, here we have to go further. She says that explicitly. She had problems with it already by that time. So I think what she was saying is, I got to do this myself. James did not do it quite satisfactorily. I guess she was hoping she might find something in Hegel that might illuminate the problems that she was facing, that the organization was facing, that the revolutionary movement was facing at that time. And the rest of her life indicates that, yes, she found it and she worked it out. The really key moment, I think, was, when she comes to the end of the discussion of the Absolute Idea chapter, she says, this notion that we've gotten from Lenin about transitions and revolutions, that's not sufficient. And Hegel is telling us that the further development, not just in ideas, not just the logic, but the further development in society, mind, the unification of objective and subjective mind or spirit, that is not a transition. So from this, she begins to work out a whole new conception. But what she's very clearly trying to do is work out a practice and a conception that offers an alternative to vanguardist theory and practice, but does not succumb to the kind of privatization of one's politics, withdrawal from the public realm, and really the abandonment of Marxism. I mean, it became clear, that throughout the decades that Grace Lee abandoned Marxism, C.L.R. James, she was already seeing that. I mean, that was, I think, part of what was going on with the hamburger recipes stuff and the lack of the objective analysis, and let's just sink ourselves into what the masses are saying and doing at the moment and take our leadership from them, or else just go in parallel to them, but without the interaction that has traditionally characterized Marxism, because the vanguardists are all about that interaction. Well, it's a specific kind of interaction, but if you don't think it through that carefully, you go, well, interaction, that could mean that we're telling them what to do, and we don't want that, so, let's just leave them alone.
Right. You kind of end up in this dead end.
Yeah, I think she was seeing this was a dead end. She didn't want to go there. She didn't want the organization to go there. She didn't want the world to go there. And it was up to her to work something out.
So, but what is vanguardism or spontaneism or some other alternative have to do with absolute mind and absolute idea? Like, what's the connection here?
They don't have anything to do with absolute spirit. That's the problem. That's the problem, is that she's focused in particular on the spontaneism of James and of Lee. She's saying that, if we care about the new society, if we care about the unification of the subjective idea of the new society, the realization of freedom, and its realization in the world, your spontaneism is not going to achieve that. And so how do we achieve this once we've said that the vanguardism is not the way to go? And so what this has to do with absolute spirit is her alternative to vanguardism as distinct from their alternative to vanguardism. She's working out a new relationship between theory and practice that's not vanguardist and is not spontaneist either. And what does theory and practice have to do with this? Well, Hegel's chapter on the absolute idea is all about the relation of theory and practice. What Hegel means by the absolute idea is the unity of the theoretical idea and the practical idea. And in a way, it's very much like what he talks about in the philosophy of spirit, because the theoretical idea is about making real the realization of the true, of that which is true. You seek truth. That's what theory is all about. So finding the truth, getting the truth, that's the job of theory. Practice is, in the best case, it's about doing good. It's about making things good. So there's been all this issue of which one is higher? And Hegel tries to overcome the division between these two concepts. Getting things right and doing good.
For Hegel, this is still theoretical practice.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
everything's kind of theoretical practice. Yeah.
But for our use, we can think of it more like practice in the real world of transforming reality.
Right. And Hegel is not, it's not that he doesn't see that, it's not that he doesn't recognize that, but and it's partly because of, he's a philosopher and that's his project. He always has ideas themselves moving. It's not like the people are doing things with the ideas. He presents it always as the ideas themselves have this movement. So he's always thinking in terms of the self-movement of ideas, which isn't wrong, but it's not a fully historical materialist way of understanding the matter.
So Dunayevskaya uses these terms movement from theory and movement from practice. In case people aren't used to hearing these phrases, is it enough to simplify and just say she just means theory and practice? Like, what's the word movement doing at the beginning of the phrase?
Yeah, movement is all important here because we're talking about unification of the two aspects. Okay, unification of theory and practice, unification of the subjective will to liberty and its realization in the institutions. That's not where you begin. So you got to move. And of course, for revolutionaries, all revolutionary thought is about movement. We're here, we have to get there, so there's got to be some kind of process of movement. But what's striking to me about the conception that Dunayevskaya worked out in opposition to vanguardism, actually in opposition to spontaneism also, is that you get a movement from two sides. You get a movement not only from theory to practice, okay, you get a movement from practice to theory, so that both sides overcome their initial condition, their initial one-sidedness and separation from the other. And since the movement from practice is really, it's a lot of movements, mass struggles and so forth, what Dunayevskaya is saying is, no, they don't need to be led by some external force, the vanguard, and nor is the realization of freedom just a matter of them spontaneously doing stuff and we're going to somehow get there. But they have to transcend their initial condition, lay hold of appropriate theory for themselves, overcome the one-sidedness, and that one-sidedness is very clearly a product of class society, of alienation, of workers not having access to education and the time to just think about concepts and so forth. So there's going to be an overcoming of that by means of the unification of the two sides. You're going to have the mass movement striving to overcome that one-sidedness, and for that it needs theory, it needs ideas. It can't just do it by its spontaneous movement. And there's this other side that wants to unify, the groups like ours, wants to unify with the masses and to, engage with them on this theoretical and philosophic level. And this is the way we're going to get there. But it's absolutely crucial, if you talk about the unification of theory and practice, that it's not just like you're putting them together like ham and cheese in a sandwich. It's not like, well, they do their thing and we do our thing, like in parallel. Okay, the point is that the initial situation is inadequate, it's unstable, it won't help us realize the goal. What the vanguardists always recognize, and they're right, is that like if we just have our ideas and they don't permeate the masses and reality, we're not going to get there. Where they're wrong is to think that they have to bring something to people that's not already there. The spontaneists, however, are like, well, you don't need any of this stuff. Whatever's there is fine, and the rest of it is just going to be picked up en route in the process of struggle, as if doing things, struggle, activity, without reflection is going to get us anywhere. I just think it's a much more realistic, down-to-earth way of that Dunayevskaya has of looking at what's needed without this kind of like dogma that the masses can't think on their own, and without the dogma which is born of we don't want anybody to mess with the masses and tell them what to think. It's not a matter of telling people what to think. It's a matter of providing people access and having engagement with them so that they can develop their own thinking.
Hey, we're going to return to this conversation in just a moment, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes to hear from Anja Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing and all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist humanism. Please join us.
If people have read any of Dunayevskaya's books, they'll see examples of this idea of the movement from practice. Maybe this is going over things you've already said, but she's not just talking about practical activity. She's talking about practical activity that constitutes like a movement of ideas, the emergence of new ideas, the emergence of new critiques of society, and the emergence of like visions for a new society. And she's saying that this isn't just like the masses spontaneously coming to ideas that like the theoreticians already worked out and we're waiting for them to come to, but that there's actually an important part of the development of ideas that comes from the struggle for freedom, right?
Yeah, and it's not only, I don't know if she ever addressed this specifically. I don't think it's only that it emerges in the course of struggle, except in the broader sense that most people live lives where every day is a struggle. But I think the point is very clearly, to me now, after many, many years, it's very clear, that her point is that the one and the same idea is present not only in groups like ours, but it's also present among the masses.
When you read Dunayevskaya, you'll see that she's often writing about, communicating with, studying mass movements that are sometimes like outside of the traditional subject of leftist thinking. She's not just like hanging out on shop floors seeing what like workers in factories are talking about.
Yeah, and she's not talking about electing 2 more members to the European Parliament.
Right. She's looking at like the struggle for freedom and Black Americans. She's looking at like the women's movement in the U.S. Wherever there's like new ideas emerging about freedom, she's interested in that because she sees that as being part of one and the same development, this movement from practice toward this idea of freedom in a new society.
Yeah, and this is what Grace Lee Boggs was referring to. I mentioned this earlier when she characterizes it as Dunayevskaya is just looking for things out there among the masses that confirm what she already thought.
Right. So why is Grace Lee Boggs wrong on that point?
Because it's not just a search for confirmation. It's trying to get the revolutionary movement and oftentimes people in her own organization to recognize that these ideas are out there and that this is the new foundation on which we can build. Instead of, what we have to do is entice people with, another struggle for 50 cents more an hour in wages, or we got to get people into our party, or we've got to do this or that. And instead of appealing to the humanism that is present among the masses and can be seen again and again, if, first of all, your eyes are open, you're listening, and second of all, you're not concerned with just the question of numbers at any moment. I mean, it may well be that, if you did some public opinion poll at any moment, you're not going to find the majority of the world's masses, certainly, in the United States, you're not going to find people agreeing with Marxist-Humanism. That's not the issue. The issue is, are these ideas out there in these mass movements among people, regular people? Are they struggling for freedom? Do they have some understanding of their own? And is this a basis on which further development can be had? This is not just a question of looking for people to confirm what people say to confirm your own views. This is about a new mode of revolutionary praxis. And it's not what Grace Lee got herself involved in, which was kind of like anything and everything by the end of her life. She was completely without any kind of like rudder and any kind of mooring and clear and consistent sense of direction. At one moment it would be like cozying up to Chairman Mao's thought, or Nkrumah, or later community gardens. I mean, this is what you have when you're just looking empirically at what seems to be out there at the moment. I don't know if she fully embraced the conception that C.L.R. James had, but he really had, underlying it all, he had the kind of an economic determinist conception as to why all that was needed was the spontaneous activity.
So, but then there's the movement from theory. And obviously, probably maybe easier for people more familiar with the idea of like theoreticians working at ideas and advancing ideas like independently. How is that a movement toward practice that isn't vanguardism? Because it's not that the theoretical ideas are like just waiting around to read the masses and see what is like being developed by the activity of mass movements or such, right? Like ideas can develop on their own. They can be worked out theoretically. They can move independently of what's like happening this week in capitalism. You could live in a reactionary age and you could still be working at theoretical ideas, and theoretical movement could still be happening regardless of whether the ideas are appearing in the world around you, right? It's like it's an independent thing on its own. They're both independent things, the movement. How does the theoretical idea move toward practice? I mean, that's a lot of what she's trying to figure out, because she's talking about a small group of people who are mostly coming from this theoretical orientation. They read Marx, they read Hegel, and they're trying to find a role for themselves in the struggle. Not just for themselves, but they want to work out this relationship of theory. So, like, how do you move toward practice when you're doing theory, besides going out and selling people newspapers and telling them what they should be thinking?
Yeah, I tell you, the newspaper selling project probably has come to an end. I mean, I think it's clear that revolutionary theory strives for, unification with practice. I mean, unless you're talking about like Herbert Marcuse and the Great Refusal and stuff. But in general, yeah, I mean, the question is really, I think the way you said it at one point, how can this be done in a non-vanguardist way? What is a non-vanguardist conception of this? And I don't know, I want to hear what you think about it, because I think you have some ideas about this. Yeah. Well,
in some ways, I think when you said earlier that you think of this as like a very practical orientation that she has, I feel the same way. Maybe it's not like some real mystical formula, but people who are thinking theoretically about things. For one thing, like something we do a lot on the podcast, for instance, for regular listeners, we're not just talking abstractly about ideas, but they're directly related to what's happening in the world. Not in a way that like we're trying to figure out how to like package some pre-existing party line into like selling points to appeal to masses of people, or not like we're trying to come up with some vanguardist political strategy in order to like get people interested in our organization in practical terms so that we can later like indoctrinate them with some pre-formed Trotskyist platform. But the ideas that we're discussing, whether they be Hegel or Marx or anything, they're being developed for the current context, which in our time is like the struggle against fascism, the struggle against reformist social democracy, climate change, and Russian war against Ukraine. All these things, they're like directly relevant to like the current struggles that are going on right now. They're not just like some abstract ideal far away. So that's like one way, like the movement from theory is directly related to practice in like current time. But there's also like a need to find ways to project ideas and to engage in the battle of ideas and to communicate with mass movements. And that's, I think, something that like our organization still strives to figure out better ways to do, because for one, we're just limited in numbers and it's a loud world full of voices all screaming at each other. So that's like still something to try to figure out how to do better. I don't actually know the answer how to do that better other than to have more people involved in those efforts to like reach more people.
Right. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily an answer, a single answer, or that we have the answer or a set of adequate answers. But yeah, I agree with everything you said. One thing that Dunayevskaya said at one point is we need to have such appreciation for the mass movements, for the movement from theory, that we never again let theory and practice get separated. And that is, I think, the really crucial point of how what she's saying is just completely different from the vanguardist conception as well as the spontaneist conceptions. If you look at the actual practice of the vanguardists, it's always maintaining a separation between theory and practice, because it's always appealing to people where they're at. It's never giving them the real ideas. It's always, saying, okay, well, what we need is this struggle for 50 cents more an hour, and then you say, we need socialism or something. But what you're trying to do is lead people step by step, like pieces along a game board, to the point where you want them to be that they are not yet. And that is not a great appreciation for the movement from below, and that is why they separate theory and practice. Dunayevskaya is saying, no, the same ideas that we have, they appear, in one form to us, but the same idea is present in the masses. It's articulated, felt, whatever, maybe in a different way, but the humanism that we're striving for is there. It's there in the African Revolution. It's there among the American coal miners. It's there in the women's liberation movement, etc., etc., etc. So we can appeal to people on the basis of the highest thinking, because it's not foreign to them, it's not alien to them, it's not being brought from the outside.
You talk about in your paper the idea that spontaneism and vanguardism actually have something in common. So what is it that they have in common?
We tend to think of them as like opposites, and they're opposites, but they're opposite sides of the same coin. And so what they have in common is a coin. And what is that coin? And what I argue in this article is that what they have in common, the coin, is external mediation. External mediation is just, it's like cause and effect is external mediation. You've got one billiard ball and it moves. So its movement is mediated. What's it mediated by? Another billiard ball. One billiard ball strikes the other billiard ball, and so it moves. There's a whole different kind of mediation, which is dialectical mediation or self-mediation, and that's what Dunayevskaya is really working out in these letters, is one and the same movement coming from two directions, moving from practice, moving from theory, unifying, each remaining itself, not fusing into one, but operating together in an ongoing movement, so that we have one process of overall movement that requires both thought and activity, right? You're not going to have self-movement self-mediation without the both sides. But what you have is with both vanguardism and spontaneism is not that. You've got mediation that is external. It's like the one billiard ball hitting the other billiard ball. It's very easy to see that in the case of vanguardism. The masses are not revolutionary, according to the vanguardist conception, on their own. So you need a billiard ball to hit them, so they'll move in the right direction, and that's the theory coming from the revolutionary intellectuals. Okay, it's harder for most people to see that spontaneism also relies on some sort of external mediation. But here's the point. When you say that there's spontaneous activity, okay, well, it could be spontaneous activity of any kind. What's going to assure that it leads to forward development? I mean, it could just be some workers in a plant ignoring the news and trading hamburger recipes. What's that lead to? What leads to an ongoing forward development of spontaneous struggle? Well, there's always got to be some assurance, and in the case of C.L.R. James, he made very clear what his underlying theory was. And he kept repeating this phrase that occurs in the next to the last chapter of Volume 1 of Capital about the revolt of the workers being organized, united, disciplined by the very mechanism of capitalist production. So what is the external mediator here? It's not a group of people like with the vanguardists, but the external mediation is the very mechanism of capitalist production. And he kept saying this again and again and again. And Dunayevskaya makes a reference to this at the end of her May 12, 1953 letter, and James keeps repeating it. You know, at one point I read, and I talk about this in the article, a whole decade later, in fact, 10 and a half years later, John F. Kennedy's assassinated. C.L.R. James is in London. He's giving a talk, and he manages to smuggle in the midst of talking about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, a couple of days before, he manages to smuggle in organized, united, disciplined by the very mechanism of capitalist production. This just became his mantra. And that was his assurance that the spontaneous struggle would develop into the new society on its own. So there's an external mediation. You just wait around for capitalism to organize the workers and to move them forward. Dunayevskaya's response to this, not necessarily in these letters, but over the years is, there is the spontaneous struggle. It is, organized, united, disciplined by the very mechanism of capitalist production, and she does say this in the 53 letters, what we reached at that point is the high point of capitalism and a deremption and a complete pulling apart of the two sides, two irreconcilable opposites. That's not yet the new society. Okay? Revolution is not yet the new society. Okay? What we need is not just revolt. What we need is the creation of new human relations. And that doesn't just arise spontaneously. And so that's what she was working on. She never rejected this idea that revolutionary sentiment is there among masses, that what kind of brings it about is the conditions that people face under capitalism, that the proletariat, has a certain discipline because of its role in society, and it faces discipline in the factories and workplaces and so forth. She didn't reject any of that. She just said this is totally inadequate if you're concerned about more than just overthrowing the old society and you want to create a new one.
Hey, that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to listen to other episodes and to read more about these issues and others. As always, if you like the podcast, we encourage you to write to us, to comment and rate the podcast, and of course to share with all your friends and enemies.